Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets.
The stranger it gets. The stranger it gets.
Here we are again, for Strange as It Seems. More back to a regular schedule, hopefully. Again, I'd have to say that we're sorry, Stephen and I, that we could not keep up even with our bi-weekly schedule. But that's because things get complicated. And, remember, this is not our job. So we're trying to do the best we can. And hopefully things will come along at a quicker pace. But if they don't, I hope that you will bear with us. Now, also, there's kind of some upfront stuff we need to get going since this thing has expanded. We're almost just shy of 2,500 subscribers, which, still
it's not nothing.
Isn't all that much. It's more than I actually initially thought we would get, so I'm gratified to see that. So, I want to thank all present subscribers. I want to thank any of you who may be listening and thinking about subscribing and urge you to do that. I also want to thank those people who have generously contributed to Patreon and other, who've helped us out there. And it looks like probably what we're going to do is to buy a better camera. That goes somewhere else, so that's where where your buy me a coffee money and Patreon will be going to.
Which I was very skeptical of doing because the last thing I want to do is be on screen and spend money on that. But I thought, probably another camera is the smart thing to do, and then we'll make our way. We're always trying to improve production value as far as lights and figure things out as we go. So the camera was the next step. So thank you to everybody who's subscribing to the Patreon, and we will be adding more from Rick's bookshelf or whatever you want to call it to that Patreon. So
yeah, we've done another one of those, and we'll do some other things as well. I mean, occasionally there are interesting things. Well, more than occasionally, a lot. There are interesting things that come up that don't really merit a full episode, but maybe do merit 20 or 30 minutes talking about, or even 15 minutes of talking about. So the other thing that I mentioned is that we have also, in the interim, acquired a sponsor in the form of Trine Day Books. And in previous episodes, you may have heard us talk about Trine Day. One of my books was published by Wall Street, and the Russian Revolution book was published by Trine Day. And I've mentioned them before without them being sponsors as I think being one of the most eclectic. And I have to say, I don't use this word lightly, kind of daring publishers out there. I really rate them as one of the top independent publishing houses in the U.S. or anywhere around. And so what I'd like to do in terms of, earning that sponsorship is to talk briefly about, other than fact saying, if you're really interested, Trine Day publishes an amazingly wide array of material. And a lot of it does deal with things like political skullduggery and conspiracy, but not all of it. And so I urge you to go and check them out. There will be a link to their site below. But I wanted to talk just briefly today about 3 of their books. And the first one...
Are these recent books?
This one came out about a year ago, I think. It's called Houses of the Holy.
Mark
How
Harris.
are we doing there?
Yeah, that looks good.
By Mark Harris. It's subtitled A Nightmare Web of Hate, Crime, Corruption, and Child Abuse. So this is, I have to say that I've met the author of this book. I've talked to him. I'm not quite sure the term to use. I guess I was kind of a consultant, or my brain was picked for different aspects of this case. And it's about, well, let me give you the basic setting of what you have here. It takes place in Florida, which some people might argue is a tip-off, or not. Apologies to you Floridians, but you know the reputation you
Florida
have.
man is a I think everybody accepts that.
Mark Harris is not a Florida man.
Okay.
Some of the people he encountered might possibly fall into that. But Mark Harris is pretty much a kind of average guy who, I guess you could say, marries the girl of her dreams. And you know, when you marry the girl of your dreams, you also marry her family.
Yeah.
Some of you know that can go very well, or it can just be a portal to hell. In his case, it was a kind of portal to hell, because as time went on, he found out the family that he had married into, and some really amazing and frightening and almost seemingly unbelievable things happen. And this will be one of his problems, is that Mark, in trying to, much of it comes down that he and his wife, while they're married, have 2 sons. They then split up, and then not so much his ex-wife, but her family it becomes a custody battle. And that's kind of how this begins. And it's a custody battle where both sides are bad-mouthing each other to prove one or the other to be unfit to have these children. And it becomes, it's really sort of Mark Harris chronicling his journey through the court system, the criminal justice system, even in relation to the church he belonged to, and in many ways finding out that not only was his ex-wife's family a very different group of people than he imagined them to be, not the cultists that eventually they turn out to be, but also the amount of corruption and obstruction that he's involved in. And I thought one of the most telling elements in it, which I'm sure is in the book, is that at one point he's constantly going to court in this custody issue, and I think it's a lawyer. I'm not sure it's his lawyer, but someone representing the court who essentially sort of buttonholes him in the parking lot and says, you should drop what you're doing. He goes, this is a cult, and if you keep up this, you're going to end up dead. And that was my question to Mark Harris after he told this tale to me. That was the only I thought it was the best question I could come up with, is why aren't you dead? I mean, there was a perfectly simple way to keep people silenced, and it does appear that certain people around these situations end up dead. So why are you still alive? Well, I think there's an interesting explanation for that, and if you read the book, you can find out. It's a fascinating, really sort of troubling story, and almost things that are kind of, dare I say, vaguely Epstein-ish about it in some respects. So the other book, which I know that Chris Milligan, the publisher of Trine Day, was very interested in promoting, was 2 World Wars and Hitler. Who is responsible? Anglo-American money, foreign agents, and geopolitics. And the authors are Dr. Jim McGregor and Dr. John O'Dowd. And the interesting thing about this is that neither one of those are PhDs in history. They are something which, in historical quarters, is often criticized, or in some cases outright condemned, which is non-historians writing history.
Yeah.
They don't have the proper credentials. That's just a non-historian writing history is just like a non-surgeon performing surgery.
Right.
It's not the same in this case. There are not lives at stake, generally speaking. They are really, John O'Dowd has a PhD and an MBA. They're essentially physicians. Particularly Jim McGregor is a medical man.
Yeah.
And from that reason, I think that he approaches things from a different perspective. I don't think that hurts. I don't think that it's one of the things about academic fields or any kind of, it can be that or it can be knitting or it can tabletop wargaming, is that the thing becomes kind of incestuous.
Yeah.
And it's often interesting to get the perspectives or the angles from people who are outside of that. And so Jim McGregor and John O'Dowd's approach to their historical research was, well, they do the same thing. They look for original sources. They try to put things together. I think they weighed material in different ways. And one of the things that in which they weighed it is that they were avowedly mistrustful of anything about World War II that came out of conventional, what could be called Oxbridge historians. Now, that's a kind of sweeping categorization, but I do think that they have a point. And their initial issue here was that what state-sponsored university historians tend to produce is a narrative which is consistent with that which the state or the powers that be want. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's anything too weird in that kind of assumption. So they're looking at it from outside of it. Now, the basic premise of this book, which again I would urge you, if you're interested in World War II, you should take a look at this book. You may decide that you don't buy it at all. You may decide, you may throw it against the wall halfway through. You may find it's the most interesting book on World War II that you have read. I found it extremely interesting and informative. There's a lot of stuff to digest in it. You're going to have to adjust your thinking if you've taken the conventional approach to the war in some respects. You may accept it or you may reject it, but you ought to know what their arguments are because they do make some arguments. Their view is that really World War II and also World War I before it were largely instigated by elements of the British establishment, partly to strengthen and hold up the British Empire, perfidious Albion, but also for a lot of people to make money. So none of that is terribly surprising. But again, if you are interested in World War II, especially its background, you need to confront the arguments that they make here. You may accept them, you may not, but you have to know what they are. The last book into today's pitch is one that I just recently received from Trine Day, and this is Spy Master of Monte Carlo. Subtitled Tales of Royalty, Espionage, and Betrayal by Robert Ehringer. And Robert Ehringer is a name that I know because he and I, although we have never met personally, do have this kind of Santa Barbara connection. We didn't live there at the same time, but we both know the same town. And Robert Ehringer is what would the book tell you about? He's a sort of, kind of James Bond for hire. I mean, he has worked as a kind of consultant for the CIA and for the FBI. He's been involved in undercover work. But at the beginning of the 2000s, he got the interesting job of organizing the Monaco Intelligence Service for what was then the Crown Prince or the heir to the throne, Albert, and then later after he becomes Prince of Monaco. Suffice to say that things get really interesting once that happens. And trying to organize a spy service for a postage stamp country mostly known as a center of corruption proves to be a challenging task. This is a very quick read. It's interesting. If you're interested in spy fiction or spy fact, you can read it either way. Spy Master of Monte Carlo is definitely a fun and in many ways informative read. So, with all that out of the way, let's get down to what we're all here for, presumably. And that's today's topic. So what are we going to be talking about today, Stephen? We're going to be talking about Erik Jan Hanussen, I think we describe him as the Nazi Rasputin, which is just one of the ways that he's been described. So what other terms have been used for Rasputin? I have a few of them written down here. And so I don't have to memorize them all. I have them written down. So he's been referred to as the prophet of the Third Reich. He's been referred to, again, as the Nazi Rasputin. He's been referred to as Hitler's Nostradamus, Hitler's clairvoyant, Hitler's psychic. He's also been called, certainly by the German press of his time, that is the late Weimar period, I thought the most interesting name was the human question mark. Hanussen, the human question mark. Also, the miracle man, the man that can see the future. But then there are also, he always had his detractors, so he's also been termed a spy and a plotter, a spook counselor to the rich and superstitious, and the high priest of weird orgies. Also, along with just basically being a fake and a charlatan and an all-around rotter. So he had his fans and he had his detractors. Now, the interesting thing is that those terms, spy and plotter, spook counselor to the rich and superstitious, and high priest of weird orgies are, as strange as they may seem, basically true. He did those things, which makes this guy quite interesting. Now, he's come up, I'm sure that I mentioned him in the episode in the Green Dragon Society. And the Green Dragon Society is going to come back into this because it just lurks around on the fringes of everything. But what we're going to do in this episode is to really hone in and take a look at Hanussen and his career and his influence. And we're going to look, differentiating between the two as best I can, between those things that are known about him, that is, facts about Hanussen, and those things that are alleged about him. Now, there are always interesting questions. One question, which was posed to me in a recent interview, is that, well, is his name pronounced Hanussen or Hanussen? And here again, I have to say, I'm not sure because I've only read the name. Now, I'm going to go with Hanussen because it sounds right to me, and that simply works. It goes off my tongue better than Hanussen because that's not what it is that I'm used to saying. But there's even that kind of a question. See, that's one of the things that you can read a term or you can read a name. But, I mean, we've all discovered this, haven't we? I suspect. At some point there was some word that you were sure was pronounced a certain way, like salmon, in terms of the fish. That wasn't me, but it was someone I know. And they were convinced well into their teens or early adulthood that the fish was a salmon. And of course, they had a good reason for that. Why is the L there if you're not going to use it? And then we're utterly kerfuffled by the fact that this was salmon. Okay. Why? Well, that's just the way that it is. So when it comes to names, how they're pronounced is always a kind of tricky business. And it occurred to me that one of the things, I was going to try to do it before this episode, and I couldn't find one, as I was going to actually try to find a Dane. Okay, because the whole argument here is that Hanussen is a Danish name, because the fellow who isn't Hanussen, we'll find out who he really is, will simply adopt that name and claim to be a Danish nobleman. So I'm going to suspect that he must have done a little bit of research to figure out whether that was a name in Denmark. Because if it was a name that no one in the country, and it's not that big of a country, had never heard of, later when he made visits to it, I'm sure someone would have brought that up. Now, he didn't speak a word of Danish, by the way, but he has an explanation for that. So maybe he had an explanation as to why his Danish name isn't really Danish. So that might be some question for one of the listeners who's Danish, who is acquainted with it, is Hanussen or Hanussen. First of all, which of those is correct? And is that really a thing in Denmark? Is it a common surname? And or is it a relatively rare name? And furthermore, is it an aristocratic name? Because he also claims that his Danish parents were aristocrats who come to a sad end, but we'll get to what that is. But since they almost certainly didn't exist, they really don't come to a sad end, so you don't need to feel sad about it too much. Now, Hanussen is a interesting historical character because he's someone who for a number of years was well known. He was a famous figure, particularly in Germany. I mean, we get to the period between about 1930 and early 1933. He is probably one of the most famous artists or celebrities that we become. He becomes a celebrity. So he starts out as a kind of stage psychic, but eventually is able to market himself as a celebrity. You know, he's going to have multiple publications. He eventually has his own book publishing house. He comes out with his own line of supplements, including Hanussen's sex cream. Okay, I'm not sure what that does, but I think you can probably make a guess.
Right.
Okay, this is in the late 20s. So whatever it is, he got it, and you can buy it. And he's got merch, so he understands that concept as well. So in his day, I'd say that in 1932 in Berlin and in much of Germany, that Erik Jan Hanussen was a name as well known as that of Adolf Hitler. And interesting that the two of them should come together. That actually, we'll see that their careers, their sort of rise to prominence, happens almost simultaneously. So he was well known in that regard, and not just there. One of the things that I found are usually their articles, news service, Hearst articles or something, but his name would show up in the American press. There'd be these full-page spreads in the Sunday supplement talking about this amazing German psychic. So he had an international reputation. He was certainly well known in Europe. He played to audiences in Denmark, France, Spain, Italy, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Throughout much of the 1920s and early 30s, he was a well-known figure and drew large crowds. I mean, this was a guy who, at his heyday in Berlin, people would scalp tickets to his shows and allegedly get into fistfights outside the theater over seats. Okay. So now, see, here again, what do we really know? He was a very popular entertainer, and his shows, he played the best theaters, like the La Scala, which is, oddly enough, in Berlin, not the one in Milan, but which was the premier vaudeville theater, we might call it. And he was very popular, and his shows did sell out, and they did attract movie stars. So people like Marlene Dietrich, Fritz Lang, Peter Lorre, along with communists and Nazis and everybody else in Berlin, all were very interested in seeing his shows. So he's almost a guy that would be difficult to ignore if you were living there at the time. And yet, after his death in early 1933, I think as one person put it, he became the man that yesterday nobody could stop talking about, and which today no one remembers who they are. Because it became, well, we'll see why that would be the case. How you could go from being that famous to a kind of non-person almost immediately. Clearly you offended some important people. Question is who? So, as always, let's sort of begin at the beginning. So I've said that Erik Jan Hanussen was not Danish, and that was not his real name. So who was he? Well, he was born in June 1889 in Vienna as Hermann Chaim Steinschneider. Both his mother and his father were Jewish. His father was named Siegfried Steinschneider. He came from a town to the north of Vienna, what's now the Czech Republic. To put things in perspective, the state, the political entity that's Steinschneider, and oh, by the way, Adolf Hitler, who's also born in 1889, just a few weeks before, so was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. So what was then called the town of Prosnitz lay some ways north of Vienna in what was then called Moravia, which was a province of Austria-Hungary. German and Czech-speaking, but also Prosnitz had a large and very old Jewish community, which was there. So that's where his father, Siegfried Steinschneider, came from. And because of that, under the laws of the time, the Hirschman Chaim, his son's birth, was recorded in two places. One in the registry of documents in Vienna, but also in Prosnitz, because it was regarded that it had to be registered in the residence or the hometown of the child's father. And there was a civil recording of that. Also, in both those cases, it was recorded in the rabbinate in both of those towns, recorded Jewish official or public records. So that is a little important detail because it means that from the time of his birth, the future Hanussen was unquestionably Jewish. It's not like he was part Jewish or his mother, his father was and his mother wasn't. None of this. And his mother was Julie Kohn. The story which is often told about this. So we know that his father was Siegfried, his mother was Julie. What did his father do? His father was he was a vaudevillian. He was a stage performer. He performed magic acts, stunts, maybe some song and dance stuff. There's also a rumor. Okay, so we know factually that Siegfried Steinschneider was a vaudevillian. And there is then the allegation that also when he wasn't on stage, he was a petty thief. I think what was actually described was a fence, that he would essentially fence stolen goods. Because one of the things is that by being part of theater groups or vaudeville groups, you travel from one town to another. So you could take goods that were stolen in Vienna and you could pawn them or sell them in Budapest. That may or may not be true, but he didn't have the best reputation. And one of the things that suggests that is that Julie Kohn's parents, who apparently came from a more middle-class, established, Orthodox Jewish family, a good Jewish family, were not pleased at all that their daughter had been knocked up by this stage performer. And they initially opposed the marriage. Nevertheless, they would get married. I don't know if it turned out to be a terribly happy one in this case. And this is also where Hanussen himself, Hirschman Chaim Steinschneider, as he originally was, would later tell a story that his first psychic act, his first awareness of his psychic powers, occurred to him in the womb, where he used his mental powers to compel his parents to get married. So this is what it was. So you got the baby in utero,
right?
Future psychic baby. You got there's a television show right there. Psychic baby. Baby Rasputin. That willed his parents to get married. Now, is that story true? I don't know. You'd have to be there, and only he was. So that gets into the question of what's the least probably reliable part of this whole story? Anything that Hanussen has to say about himself. Now, in some cases, it's quite accurate, usually when it reflects upon him positively. But yes, he did indeed suffer from that all too human frailty of making stuff up. So he basically followed in his father's footsteps. So by the time he is an adolescent, by the time the 20th century begins to roll around, he's also working with different vaudeville groups, traveling theater groups, basically a group of acts that would join together. Initially, there's very little distinction between this in some cases, between the sort of vaudevillian world. I'm sure you get arguments about vaudevillians about this, and the circus and carnival world. And early on, most of his work seems to have been more something you would expect to see in a carnival sideshow. That included things like what was supposedly allegedly his first real act he put on: glass eating.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Jeez.
So how do you go from being a glass eater to being Hitler's Rasputin? Well, you have to hang on this episode and find out. Glass eating is it's like sword swallowing and fire eating. There's a certain technique to it, and you have to be very, very careful, and don't try that at home. But it was a stunt that he would perform, and it's a kind of a sideshow stunt. There is even a story, which I've only seen referenced in one place. And it says that, this must have been still when he was a teenager or maybe very early adulthood. His first real act was that he styled himself Steno the Great, which I guess he took from Steinschneider. So Steno the Great was a glass eater, but he also picked up sword swallowing, fire eating, a few other sort of magic tricks along the way. Mm-hmm. This is one of the things you see about Hanussen, is that he continually broadens and refines his act. He found out what audiences wanted to see, and he would give it to them. And that as Steno the Great, he traveled with an Austrian circus to Russia. So this is, well before World War I. And during this tour of Russia, they performed before Tsar Nicholas. He then he was just beginning to develop the whole idea of doing psychic readings. And he did a psychic reading, or one just kind of came over him. And he told the Tsar that your empire is going to fall and you and your entire family are going to die. Whereupon he was expelled from the Russian Empire. So, did that ever happen? Probably not. But again, it's interesting that story would later... there may actually have been a Steno the Great. I'm not sure that Steno the Great was really hot, but it could have been. It could well have been that that's something that he did, because his whole early life is... lots of it are hazy. Not many people are talking, recording much of what's going on. It's a subculture, and really it's a kind of low-life subculture. You're talking about generally itinerant, often provincial, novelty acts, circus acts of one kind or another. He certainly did work for a couple of circuses. But it was, learning what would work. And it's the term that was used for this subculture was Yenishman. Okay, if someone who worked in this was a Yenish. Yenish was a kind of language. It was a kind of a carny language that they would speak among themselves. And because a fair proportion of these performers, the people in the subculture, were Jewish, a lot of the words in it were of Yiddish derivation. In fact, in some cases, Yenish has been described as just this kind of almost, not quite a criminal argot or argot, but something similar. So it was a way they could kind of communicate with each other without the rubes figuring out what they were talking about. Secret carny language. You always knew that existed. So that's the kind of culture he comes from. And there's nothing overtly religious about him. We'll come back to that in a minute, in terms of a kind of Orthodox Jewish sense. He clearly will then begin, as Hanussen, will create a public persona which is about as far away from that as he can get. And, I'd say that if you are essentially an Austrian or Czech Jew and you restyle yourself as a Danish aristocrat, you are trying to obscure something in that regard. So his early years are taken up in this kind of learning the trade, in this sort of carnival or theater subculture. And then World War I rolls around for everybody in 1914. And Steinschneider, as we'll still call him, is drafted into the army. And one of the things that he has already changed by this time is that, remember, his birth name is Herschman Chaim. Well, that's kind of long, and it's maybe way too Jewish for his taste. And so he turns, even early in his career, he turned Herschman, he drops the Chaim, and he turns Herschman into Hermann. But then, by the time we get to 1914, he's known as Harry. And that also, it gives him a slightly foreign sound to it. I don't know. How common it was for someone in Austria or Germany in that period whose name was Hermann to start calling themselves Harry. But he did. So now he's become Harry Steinschneider. Well, let's go back. Before we take him off to war, where he will go, and where eventually Hanussen will emerge out of that, let's, before we leave his youth behind, let's say something. I said before that he was not, while he would clearly try to, for stage purposes, obscure or hide his Jewish identity, he never goes to any great lengths to do that. This is one of the things that's going to be kind of odd later on. For instance, he never changes his name, and therefore, legally, on all of his contracts, on his passports, it still says Hermann Steinschneider, right up until 1933. So, he never bothers to do that. He never tries to erase his original name. He is married at least 3 times, the last one in 1928. And in all 3 of those marriages, those are Jewish marriages officiated and recorded by a rabbi. So he's not trying to distance himself too far from his Jewish roots. He actually still sort of keeps the name. He's still that person. And when he's married under that name. And if he's going to get married, he has a Jewish marriage. So if he was completely... The interesting thing is, it would seem to me, is that if he was utterly alienated from his Jewish roots, he wouldn't have continued to be married in Jewish ceremonies up until 1928. So I think in some ways it strikes me as almost it was a kind of matter of indifference more than it was any particular attachment. So it was always an open secret. Most of his friends in the entertainment world knew who he was. Certainly, after World War I, the new Czechoslovakian government that issued it, because that's what happened after World War I. He woke up one morning and now he was a citizen of Czechoslovakia, because that's where his father's birthplace was, and they issued him a passport. I think it's interesting that he ended up that as opposed to an Austrian, because he's actually born in what would later become the Republic of Austria, the little state that emerged out of that. But the passport he carries is Czech, again, based upon the home village. So that takes us back to Prosnitz. And Prosnitz is a kind of, at that time, a kind of medium-sized town, a large town. And again, it had, the Jewish community there probably dated back at least 500 years. So it was well established. The Steinschneiders, as a kind of local clan, well, they came into being. The first Steinschneider was a fellow who was named Aaron Daniel Steinschneider, who took that surname as Jews were required to do in the Austrian Empire in the 18th century. So it's not really until the early mid 1700s that the name is picked. And that sort of brings up, so you're going to pick a name. Well, you could do it for a number of reasons. Why did he pick Steinschneider? Which means basically stonecutter or stone tailor. A Schneider is a cutter, but also that's the term we use for a tailor. So, well, stonecutter. That's
Freemason.
Okay. Freemason. Well, okay, that's not quite what we're getting into here, but it's interesting that that's what the name basically means. But, well, I said that the first guy who took that name was someone simply known as Aaron Daniel, who was the son of Daniel before he became Steinschneider. So what was he? He wasn't a stonecutter. He was a rabbi. The son of a rabbi. Who was the son of a rabbi? So, in Hanussen's background, in his Jewish ancestry, there is a string of rabbinical figures. So later on, when he would argue that I am descended from miracle-working rabbis, that was true. I mean, at least that he was descended from them is true, because the Wunderrebbe. Wunderrebbes were rabbis who had gone beyond mere religious study and largely through delving into the mystical Kabbalah became interested. Well, they became folk magicians. They were a religious figure combined. They were a kind of sorcerer, or I think the better way to put it, they were a rabbi who had transcended through occult practices to shamanhood. You know, talking to angels.
Would this be similar to our last episode where the rabbi is giving his addressment to all these Freemasons? Was that a similar kind of a Kabbalic? I don't even remember.
The term never comes up there. Okay. I mean, I'm sure someone would look at it and go, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. You get all these people together. This must have something to do with the Kabbalah. I don't see that there.
Okay.
But these, Kabbalah is, I'm not going to try to explain it here, is broadly mystical Judaism.
Yeah.
It's a whole kind of other way of interpreting everything from the holy works themselves, and depends upon various means, often numerological and others, to interpret religious material. But both Aaron Daniel and his father, Daniel the Younger, which means there must have been a Daniel the Elder, had this reputation as Wunderrebbes or wonder rabbis, and that included not only these kind of shamanic-like powers, a kind of mystical revelations, but also how do you demonstrate those powers? That was always the if you have these, you'll be given some sort of signs, right? And it's and the most common ones were the ability to fly or to make yourself invisible.
Wow. So, monks, basically. Or, well, never mind.
Well, that could be, certainly in things like Tibetan Buddhism, you would find that a sign of mystical enlightenment is to, bilocation. Mm-hmm. But to make yourself invisible or to fly, but those are also things that might be commonly connected to, especially the flying part, witches. Okay. So, to what extent would the practices, the Kabbalistic practices of these Wunderrabbi be in a Christian context be construed simply as witchcraft? Were they Jewish warlocks? Mm. I don't think they would see it that way, but some might. Now, the interesting thing is that these people actually existed. Those claims about them existed. Whether they actually made the claims about themselves or others made it for them, those were things that were attached to them. And Hanussen, a.k.a. Steinschneider, embraces their inheritance and argues that what he's doing in the 20th century, that his actions, his psychic abilities are really just extensions, that he is, what he's basically arguing is that I am a wonder rabbi without actually being a wonder rabbi.
Yeah.
So now, also connected to that is the story early on from his youth that he actually studied to be a rabbi himself. He was going to follow in the rabbinical footsteps of his ancestors, but he became distracted. And what did he become distracted by? Two things. One, women. The other, the Kabbalah. And he then was attracted more in that direction, so he was going to spend his life chasing women and practicing the Kabbalah, and therefore fled from the village also after he got a girl pregnant, which was also bad. So, that kind of failed rabbinical students who turned to the Kabbalah and magic and carnivals. Okay. That would be a story right there. You drop out of rabbinical school and become a carny, and then a psychic, and then an advisor to Hitler. Right. All in one relatively brief lifetime. So we get back to this fellow with these very stories that have been told about him. So the war rolls along. He gets drafted. And the one thing that seems most obvious about his war experience is that he manages to spend as little time at the front as possible, which is not a bad thing to do. So that is, there are some, he would claim at one point to have been part of a machine gun unit that was actually at the front and to have been wounded. And that may be true. One of the things, I haven't seen, and I'm not entirely clear to me that anyone has really seen, are his military records, or his war records. To the extent that they are, in all of them, they certainly exist or existed at one time. Mostly he served in rear echelon assignments. And again, here is some kind of interesting story. So we know he's in the army. We know that in 1918, when the war ends and the army collapses and the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, that he will have been promoted to a lance corporal, which is exactly the rank that Adolf Hitler will be promoted to. So keep this in mind. They're both born in the same year, a few weeks apart. They're both born as subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's a little deal, don't forget. Hitler is born in German-speaking Austria-Hungary, not in Germany proper. In fact, he won't even become a German citizen until the early 1930s. They also will both spend a lot of their early years in Vienna. So when Hitler, is painting pictures for frame shops and where he's living in hotels and men's hostels and the rest of us, in the years that he's kicking around there, those are the same years that Harry Steinschneider is playing in theaters in the province, but also in Vienna, which is playing there. So it is entirely possible. Wouldn't be that strange at all if a young Adolf Hitler had bought a ticket for a stage show which featured Harry Steinschneider, maybe eating glass, probably doing his mind-reading act. They both get drafted into World War. Hitler volunteers. Steinschneider is almost certainly conscripted. Now, he ends up, Steinschneider serves in the army that Hitler should have served in, the Austro-Hungarian. But they're both in the war. They both come out of the war with having achieved the same rank. It's almost as if somehow they are fated to be together. So what he did during the war, here are some of the stories that are attached to it. One is that one of the things is that a soldier in the front lines that you would be very concerned about was when the enemy was going to start shelling you, when a bombardment was going to come down. And Steinschneider could pick up the psychic emanations, and he could warn of when there was going to be an approaching attack. That was kind of valuable. The other thing, for which there seems to be a little better evidence that he could do, that is, someone who clearly said that he did it and saw him do it, was dowsing for water. We hold the sticks and try to figure out whether there's water. Why was that a big deal? Well, because sometimes positions would be established in areas where there wasn't any water nearby. Plus, any wells in the immediate vicinity of the front are going to be contaminated or destroyed. So one of the issues you would often have is you would either have to bring lots of water forward, but thirst in the trenches, and I've run across this before, was a real issue. So he could find, dig here, and there's water. That, again, would come in handy. But most of his service seems to have been behind the lines, supply or clerical positions, and that's where, by 1916 or 1917, he has now been transferred into something that would be like the Austro-Hungarian Army's USO. That he was okay. That makes sense. What was he? He was a performer.
Yeah.
And he's already doing a mind reading act by this time. Maybe it started out predicting bombardments, but a couple of years later, he's now behind the lines and he's going around to different places at the front and delivering what are described as patriotic demonstrations of hypnotism.
How does that work?
I don't know. Patriotic hypnotism.
Okay.
You have to imagine the context of the war. He would go into a trance and go, we're going to win. Okay, and that's it. Everything will be fine. In this case, usually by hypnotizing other subjects. But he was a stage hypnotist who was going around entertaining the troops.
Right. He's Bob Hope.
Later on, at the very end of the war, he shifted down to the Balkan area, down to Bosnia. And that's where, among other things, he continues his dowsing, he continues giving hypnotism demonstrations, but he also gets involved in a criminal investigation. So there was a local landowner who is found murdered, a Muslim Bosnian landowner with a surname of Aga Zinic. And so the whole question is who killed him? And Steinschneider certainly participates in the investigation, and in the alleged version of this is responsible for breaking the case. Huh. Now that's something that will then continue to be part of his repertoire for the rest of his life, is becoming a psychic who is either brought into or inserts themselves into criminal investigations.
Those are my favorite.
Yeah. So he's one of the pioneers in this.
Nice.
I am receiving psychic messages.
The body is over here in this field.
Yeah. Now, this is the one thing that you have clearly by this period. I mean, one of the things is that mentalist acts, as they were called, as part of the stage, circus, popular entertainment traditions, those are acts. And people within that subculture would recognize that there's a technique which is used.
Have you seen the mentalist who was part of the White House Correspondents' shooting? I mean, he was there like when the shooting happened, and he had done he's been on Joe Rogan, Israeli guy, but explains how he does it, right? Or not all the way, but shows. And it's a pretty practical, it's like card guessing or card counting. But yeah, he was right there right when it happened. Everyone's like, he's predicting the shooting. It's like, no, he was predicting somebody's baby's name or something like that. But
yeah, it's usually you work with an assistant and there's a code. So this is, the basic act that Hanussen would really start out with is where he's on stage and he's blindfolded and his assistant is in the audience. And she goes, I have a question. Or people would put, questions on envelopes and send them to him and he would open them or he would read them. He would know what was it. It's the Great Carsoni. It's the old Johnny Carson. Yeah. What was it? The Great Carsoni. Okay. What is on the card? I read it and then I will give an answer to it. Well, you're all being told this in these code words that are coming from your assistant. So if your assistant is out in the audience and goes, there is a gentleman here, and the very use of a gentleman, the way the words are put together is then giving you a description of who this person is. So yes, it's an act. It's fakery. It's trickery.
Yeah.
It is an imitation of actual mind reading.
Stage magic, right.
But one of the things that Hanussen, and I would say that the trickery part of it, the act, is easily 99% of what Hanussen does. But some of his predictions are oddly uncanny. And there will actually be, we'll discuss a court case that would occur in 1929 and 1930, which would apparently prove his psychic abilities in a Czechoslovakian court of law.
Wow.
Well, he would say they would. But he will actually be prosecuted for being a fraud. Actually taking advantage of stupid people. That's what he's actually put on trial for. Huh. There was a law.
You know, there's a law. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of people are stupid, and if you use superstition to take advantage of stupid people, that's a crime. And that's what they said he was doing. So he would, in some cases, talk about being just, receiving these transmissions without really asking for them. So they go, sometimes these things just come to me, and I don't really ask them to come to me. And they just kind of appear. And I think to one of his associates says, those are the ones that really kind of freak me out because those turn out to be true. So I think I do actually have some kind of psychic ability, you would say, but that's undependable. You can't make an act out of that. Okay, you can't go on stage and then say, well, I'm going to stand here for the next hour to see whether or not the forces of the universe send me a message. Okay, that wouldn't work. So you need to have an act that you can do. But I think, personally, he did believe he had some kind of power. And, I mean, if you don't believe in the possibility of that, then certainly he didn't. And I'm not going to argue he did. And I'm not too quite sure how I feel about it. But if such things exist, he may have had a touch of it. So, which only enhanced his reputation over time, I suppose. It's also supposedly during the war that he first comes up with this alias of Erik Jan Hanussen. And that was because, and here's a strange thing, the war is on, he's in the army. And yet one of the things that we know is that on at least one occasion, for a 2-week period in 1917, he is appearing in a theater in Vienna, in civilian clothes, doing his Steinschneider act. Now, so he was somehow getting, well, there are two explanations for this. One is that he was going AWOL, that he was simply running away from the army, going off, performing for days or weeks, and then coming back and hoping all would be forgiven. I don't buy that because no army is going to be that forgiving. You might get away with that once, you're not going to get away with it repeatedly. So what he almost certainly did was to make some kind of agreement with his superiors that he would get a leave, that he was given leave to go and perform. Now, the argument is that he came up with a Hanussen name and what he thought was a Danish, or at least Danish-sounding name, because a war was on, and questions might be asked why an otherwise seemingly able-bodied man was performing on stage as opposed to being at the front. And if you were a foreigner, especially if you were a neutral foreigner, Danes weren't the enemies of anybody in that part of Europe, then people wouldn't ask questions. That could be. But I think that may be kind of backdating the name. Here's where it really first comes into focus. It's around 1919 and 1920. The war is over. He's back where? He's in Vienna. He's back doing what? He is doing his mentalist. His stage act has now almost entirely become a mentalist act, a kind of mind-reading act. He will continue to broaden and refine that as time goes on. And that's, where the Hanussen...
Nobody could say.
Okay. That's where Hanussen comes in, I think, as a way to just kind of broaden his appeal. One, it doesn't, for anybody who had who didn't like to go see Jews on stage, they would no longer have a problem with that. And it just kind of added to his exotic appeal. Now, the question that might have come come to, I know,
It's so exotic.
Danes.
I mean, maybe I don't know. I don't know my cultural context of that time period.
Also unoffensive.
Yeah,
it's I could be wrong about this, but other than with fellow Nordics,
yeah.
I mean, I've been told that Danes and Swedes don't particularly get along.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I'm not sure how Norwegians fit into that picture. I do know that I was told by an Icelander that they mistrust all other Nordics. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So what? But other than that, Denmark's had a fairly, the last couple of centuries, peaceful history, and they are likely to be inoffensive.
Well, yeah. My question, I guess, would be: so we're leading up to the National Socialists, and there's already a well-founded a well-established anti-Semitic kind of is that an undercurrent? I mean, I know it's a very integrated population of Jews, but at the same time, was it still kind of a faux pas to be an overt, like an entertainer, Gershwin?
We're also talking about Vienna. And Vienna was, it was now, after the war, simply the much too big capital for a very small country.
Oh.
But Vienna, remember, was and had been just months before the capital of a large multinational empire. So in many ways, Vienna was a small version of that empire.
Okay.
It might have been predominantly German-speaking, but there were all sorts of people there, Czechs, Poles.
Yeah.
And most of what would later be Austria's Jewish population lived in Vienna. And so, again, they were quite well established there. It was, there was always an element of... There was a popular strain of anti-Semitism, which, remember, just means anti-Jewism, although nobody likes to say that. But here's one way you might look at it. If you went back to the pre-war era, again, that era where young Steinschneider was learning his ropes on stage and Hitler was not learning his ropes as an artist, that the longtime mayor of Vienna was a fellow by the name of Carlo Lueger, fairly famous figure in Viennese. No, not Vietnamese. Political history. Carlo Lueger was a populist politician who was repeatedly elected as mayor and did so largely in the grounds of Jew bashing.
Okay.
That there were too many Jews. They're coming in from Poland. They're taking over. I'm going to control, with me in charge, I'll make sure the Jews don't take over.
Yeah.
Which they did not. On the other hand, one of his opponents noted that Carl Lueger was friends with many of the wealthiest Jews in Vienna and regularly played cards with them.
Yeah.
Belonged to the same sort of private club they did. And the whole question was, Herr Lueger, how is it that you can condemn Jews and you say you're going to keep the Jews under control in Vienna, while in fact you associate with are friends, apparently, with many of the wealthiest and most influential Jews in the city. And Lueger's response to that was that I'll decide who's a Jew and who isn't. Okay. So, good political response.
Fair enough.
And that, I sort of use that to suggest that certainly anti-Semitism existed, but probably most of it was more... The anti-Semitism existed basically against funny-looking Jews, Orthodox Jews with sidelocks and black cassocks who'd just come in from Galicia or one of the eastern provinces. No one was going to say this about a good, upstanding Jewish family like, say, the Freuds.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or Julie Kahn's family. So there were two very different groups there. But, in terms of... Well, here's something to keep in mind. One might look at the very large number, not so much anymore, but well into 60s and 70s, of American Jewish entertainers who changed their names. Milton Berle.
Mm-hmm.
I think Steve Lawrence and Eddie Gourmet. Because it fit on the bill easier. and it didn't completely advertise your ethnicity.
Yeah.
Which in some cases, anyway, it's, if you had, for instance, sort of started your career playing the Borscht Belt, and if you've never heard of that, you need to go look that up. I'm not going to explain it. You started playing the Borscht, which means you were largely playing to resorts, and largely to Jewish audiences, and you wanted to broaden your appeal to a larger audience.
Right.
It was simply best to try to, what was seen as economically sensible, to mainstream yourself in some way. So the interesting thing is that what Harry Steinschneider did was not exactly mainstream himself, but he made himself exotic.
Right.
So the question might be, how did he pass this off? Because he doesn't speak Denmark. He's never been to Denmark. He doesn't even know anything about it. He's probably never seen a Lego. Okay, Denmark's great contribution to the world.
Just the one.
Yeah, I'm just kind of kidding, Danes. But really it is. So how did he explain that? And he goes, oh, well, here's how it worked. See, my parents were Danish aristocrats. And back in 1888, 89, or I guess back when I was but a toddler, they went on a mountain climbing trip to Moravia near Prosnitz.
You left me there or something?
No, they were killed in a mountain climbing accident.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's better.
So they apparently left me with somebody, and they went up climbing in the Moravian mountains, which there are no high mountains in Moravia. It's like the Alps.
Okay.
I mean, there are mountains, but if I was going to go from Denmark to go mountain climbing, Moravia, I don't know why you would go there, or what you could fall off of. So anyway, his parents were killed in a tragic mountain climbing accident, and he was then taken in by an elderly Jewish couple called the Steinschneiders, who adopted him and raised him as their own. Because he apparently had no other noble relatives back in Denmark who might come looking for him.
Yeah.
So he goes, you see, that's why I know all these Yiddish words that I use in my speech all the time, and why so many of my friends are Jews. and he would do that. He goes, when people would make anti-Semitic remarks to him, he'd go, yeah, no, Jews are okay. I grew up around them. I tell you, they're fine. Okay, my adopted parent. Which was true. He did grow up around them. Just not in what circumstance it might be. So it's a complete bullshit story, which would never pass muster from anyone. But nevertheless, it will. Now, he was also thoughtful enough to do something. He had a document of adoption forged at some point to show that he was actually adopted by this Steinschneider couple, kindly old people who took care of him. And he would later brandish that for someone who would question it. It didn't exist. Okay, he paid somebody to do it. But he was rich, and he could afford to do that. So he's now shifting more and more into mind reading. This includes putting himself into trances, putting other people in hypnotic trances. And he also finds that he has a kind of competitor. And not a competitor in the mind reading racket, but a competitor on stage for being a big star. And this is also, by the way, another Jewish vaudevillian by the name of Sigmund Breitbart, or Zisha Breitbart. He's a strong man. In fact, Breitbart advertises himself as the strongest man in the world. He is the Jewish Hercules.
All right.
And he's a big, by modern standards, he doesn't look all that buff. But he does the strongman art of bending steel, biting chains in half. Another one of his acts was pounding metal spikes into oak logs with his head.
Ugh.
Okay. Yes.
Sounds like my son's.
Okay. Well, keep in mind, he will be killed by an accident in one of his acts, which I don't think had to do with pounding nails with his head. But it would involve gashing himself severely and dying of blood poisoning.
Okay.
So Breitbart, the Jewish Hercules, was the big star, and the newly minted Hanussen felt that was a kind of competition, And so they began this whole thing of kind of insulting each other. And Hanussen eventually came up with this, and he goes, look, the key to all this, first of all, he would argue what he's doing is an act, and these are all props. Okay. And it's, well, take that back. He wouldn't accuse Breitbart of outright faking. Because if you're a faker and you accuse the other guy of faking, which he is, he can just as easily accuse that. So you are the same thing. So this is how he got around it. Hanussen argued, I bet, using my vast mental powers, I could take someone like, I don't know, a girl. I could take a frail female, and through hypnotic suggestion, make her capable of performing every act of strength Breitbart does, but without his muscles, thus demonstrating that his muscles are stupid. Okay, think of this as a stage act battle between brains and brawn, and he does and Hanussen does exactly that. He finds this Italian woman who had been working in the circus. Her name is different ways. Usually it's Marta Farah. And he became her Svengali. And the whole act was that he would hypnotize her, and then she would go out, and she was, not muscular, and she would bite through chains and bend iron and do all of these things. And he would argue that through my mental powers, I can increase her strength 5-fold. And she's even stronger than Breitbart, who's just, a puffed up nobody. Now, as you might already be expecting, since Breitbart and Hanussen made this feud public and were sort of trading barbs back and forth and engaged in a fairly obvious competition, what if that was also an act? What if they were doing this not because they were actually antagonistic to each other, but because it was mutual promotion? This is something, you create a feud and you act that out. I mean, that's what modern wrestling...
Yeah.
Well, let me put it this way. Not wrestling, wrestling. This is what wrestling is based upon. The whole idea of good, people creating these phony feuds between them. Yeah. So I kind of suspect that's what was going on. So in 1923, Breitbart, who's still, while he's alive, was probably the bigger star, goes on a fairly triumphal tour to where? If you're going to leave Europe, where would you go?
Jamaica.
Well, you could get there from there. America. You go to New York.
Yeah,
you're going to play. You're going to make it in New York. And because there's also this whole temptation. This is the early 20s. Hollywood contract. Okay.
Yeah.
Jewish strongman, Jewish Hercules. What could Samuel Goldwyn do with him? Okay. Maybe we can make a movie out of it. I can't act anyway, but he can sure bite those chains in half. So Breitbart's tour was fairly successful. He got a lot of good coverage. And so Hanussen, I think to kind of follow up on that, got Marta Farah, and in early 1924, they come to New York, and you've got their whole sort of entry records. And here's the interesting thing to look at is what name did he use when he entered the United States? What name did he give to U.S. immigration? The name he gave was Erik von Hanussen Steinschneider with a hyphen. So he's combining his, you might ask, is that, wouldn't his passport be different? Probably at that point he didn't have a passport, and if he didn't, he wouldn't have had to show it. Usually you didn't in that period. Very, very few countries actually required a passport to enter. Traveling was so much freer in those days. But that's how he described himself. You can almost see him. He's kind of grafted these characters together. Yeah. He's still Steinschneider. He's still, and the phone is the noble part of it, which he somehow drops. I don't know why. So the phone, that's the only place I've seen von Hanussen, which is used. His American tour is, by his own description, a bust. He thinks that American audiences, they're all a bunch of hicks. They can't understand what I'm doing. They cannot appreciate my genius. They throw things. Okay, they don't buy the act. They've seen this type of thing before, and whether American audiences were simply unsophisticated or whether they were jaded on this type of thing, the stage performances. He initially says he's going to be in the country for 6 months. I don't think that they're there that long, so it doesn't look like the formal theater performances go that well. Develops a distaste for New York, but apparently he really likes San Francisco for some reason. Now, hang on, we'll figure out how he'll work that in later on, how he'll display his dislike for New York. So, but there is an American news story that puts a different cast on this. They go that, oh, well, he left America. He cleaned up in America. And the way that he cleaned up wasn't through stage bookings. It was through giving private readings to people in New York and other cities. Because they go, what is it that a Wall Street financier wants to know? Which way is the market going? Which stocks should I buy?
Yeah.
Which stocks should I sell? Hanussen, for a certain amount of money, would go into a trance and give you advice. Society women would want to know if their husbands were cheating on them. Other people would want to know answers to one question or another. And in that way, according to a press article, how would they know? He made lots of money. So it wasn't totally and that's always part, as he becomes more and more famous, that becomes part of what he's doing. He gives public performances, but he also gives private séances and readings. And rich people pay him a lot of money for those. So the American tour isn't that big of a deal, but over the next few years, he continues to tour. His reputation grows. And it's around 1928, 1929 when he's playing a theater in Czechoslovakia at a place called Leitmeritz. It has another Czech name, which I cannot pronounce right now. But at the time, it was part of the Sudetenland. It's called Leitmeritz. And this is where a local ambitious prosecutor decides that he's been taking advantage of stupid people through superstition. And that he's also misrepresenting himself. That the whole idea is you don't actually... Now, the whole basis of the prosecution's case is that psychic abilities, ESP basically, does not exist. And that therefore anyone who claims to have psychic powers is lying. And using that to take advantage of credulous people. So the case kind of drags on. It starts at one point and the prosecution decides it doesn't have enough evidence, but eventually it sort of wraps up in early 1930, the summer of 1930, and it's covered in the press. There are even references to it in the U.S. press, particularly when he wins. There's a panel of experts that are brought in, 4 of them, who are going, and they're going to give him different tests to perform. And those tests are things like... being able to read sealed messages, being able to say who the message came from, the usual sort of psychic tests. Now, in the end, 2 of those experts still think he's faking, but they can't figure out how he's faking. The other 2, however, believe that he has convincingly demonstrated that he does indeed have some kind of mental powers, which under the rules of the time means that he is acquitted of all charges. Now, Hanussen uses this as a big advertising technique to argue that, see, I am the only psychic who can say that my powers were tested in a court of law and they were proven by the verdict to be true. Actually, what it did was that what the state couldn't do was to prove that he was faking, which was not the same thing as demonstrating that his powers were real, only that they couldn't prove that they weren't real. But no, he knows how to market these things. So that increases, he knows also what the trial is. He knows that the trial is free publicity. So he milks that for all he can. While he's there, he also tries to help the local police solve crimes, always to show off. He'd been doing that the whole time. There was a in the mid-20s, around the same time, 1928, there's a famous, one might say infamous case in Germany called the Vampire of Dusseldorf. And this was a serial killer who terrorized Dusseldorf and much of Western Germany. And a really, really unpleasant guy, Peter Curtin, who just killed young girls in very unpleasant ways. And just imagine Weimar era German serial killer, which there are quite a few. And so, and Hanussen inserts himself into that case and actually tries to do something that you've seen in modern serial killer cases. He establishes communication with the killer. So one of the things that Curtin does is that he sends taunting messages to the police. Does that sound familiar? And giving them clues where they can find bodies. And Hanussen tries to develop this connection. So for the early connection to the whole, before serial killers were serial killers, use that name, he's a part of it. That actually, I should step back a little bit and say, that was something that also began right after the war in Vienna. And there was one case in particular where sheets of newly printed bills, money, kroner, were disappearing from the engraving office. They couldn't figure out where these things were going. Whole sheets of new bills. Hanussen was called in, or probably first volunteered to look into it, and eventually he identified the culprits, and they were arrested and confessed their crime. Now, the way that he later explained that to a fellow performer when they asked him how he did it, because their assumption was that, okay, how did you do that, Erik? And he goes, well, it was relatively simple. Okay, I looked around and I figured out this has to be an inside job. And then it just comes down to figuring out who is it that's working in the engraving office, who's doing it. And then you begin to look at the different... One of the things that he supposedly described his whole approach to everything was that first you figure out the angles, and then you calculate the odds. So in this case, the angle was that it was an inside job, and the odds by which of the employees there looked the most guilty, and he picked the right one. A process of Dick Tracy-like deduction, okay? Not psychic powers, but of simple deduction. The police in Vienna and the police in other cities later were not always, in fact, probably not usually appreciative of his help. In the same way they would feel about the unsolicited help of psychics today, because it makes it look like what? They can't do their job. All right. So, you guys can't figure it out. I, with my powers, okay, and my turban, will be able to come in and figure out who the culprit is. And in the case of the Vienna police, they came to suspect that what he was doing is that he was, in fact, in some way in on these crimes, or was setting crimes up, using unsavory associates from his carny years, maybe people or petty thieves like his dad, getting them to commit these crimes. And in fact, in one case, he was accused of getting people to commit a crime, framing somebody else, and then he accuses the person who's being framed, thus completing the frame, getting the people who actually committed the crime off the hook. So he's actually part of a criminal gang who's pretending to solve crimes while actually committing them. Could be. I mean, I wouldn't put that past him. He is, as we will see, utterly unscrupulous. So he comes out of the Leitmeritz trial, and then on into Berlin, and he sort of by the late 1930, he has become more or less permanently established in Berlin. He'll still travel around other places, but that now becomes home, and he has an apartment there. He mostly performs there. He becomes very well known within the city. So this is around September 1930, and there are other changes afoot. And one of those changes is that it's also in this period that Hitler and the Nazi Party emerged from the German political fringe into the mainstream. So to me, that's an interesting comparison. Hanussen now turns up in the German capital in what is generally considered to be the most freewheeling, influential cultural scene in interwar Europe. Is in Weimar, Germany. Certainly had lots of, the place was supposedly overrun with swamis, soothsayers, palm readers.
Yeah.
And so for him to see center stage in a very crowded field is itself a kind of achievement. He was able to put almost all the other ones in the shade, which, by the way, didn't make friends of them, made many enemies.
Well, who
then made it their job to try to expose him. Okay.
I was going to ask if he's associated with, my understanding is Berlin was much more of a left-leaning environment just because of all the entertainers and the kind of the cultural context.
Berlin was kind of Red Berlin. So the Nazis have their origins in Munich,
right?
Down south, in happy Germany, leather pants, slapping your thighs, Oktoberfest.
Yes.
Okay. So the same Germany that gave us Oktoberfest gave us the Nazis.
Right.
Chew on that for a while. So
I like Oktoberfest.
Bavarians. Berlin, on the other hand, was the Communist Party. That was one of its bastions. Was in the working class areas of Berlin because it was a large industrial center. So the Nazis had a kind of uphill road there.
Yeah.
It wasn't their home turf. They were seen as hicks from Bavaria for the most part. There were even problems. There were at least 2 rebellions within the Nazi Party in Berlin, specifically the Berlin Party, against Hitler in the early 30s.
Is this where the Strasser brothers are from?
Strasser, well, there's a guy named Walter Stennis, who's the head of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the brown shirts.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just going to call him the SA. Yeah. He's fed up with Hitler for other reasons than the Strasser brothers, and he just proclaims a rebellion. Huh. And then is brought back into the party, and then a few months later declares a second rebellion. And these are, rebellious brown shirts attacking other brown shirts. So the whole Nazi Party's hold in Berlin is fairly slight. So you would assume, that generally it's a city where, let's say, in which the political and even cultural left had ascendancy.
Yeah.
And Hanussen doesn't ignore those people initially. I mean, he will always argue that I'm completely apolitical. I just say what I see. I get these visions. If I predict the Nazis are going, if I predict that Hitler will become Chancellor of Germany, that's because what the stars tell me. Oh yeah, he adds astrology into this. Anything that will predict can be used as a predictive tool, because that's what he's figured out that people are most interested in. They want to know what's going to happen to them or what's going to happen to circumstances around them. And so more and more what he does is based upon becoming a soothsayer, a hellseher. But he'll eventually, so it's interesting that over a period of time, he will veer more and more and become a kind of psychic cheerleader for the Nazis in a city which is not a Nazi stronghold. So it's almost going against the grain. And that will bring a lot of people against him. But keep in mind, he always has people against him. So if you go back to the Breitbart thing, he has a history of picking feuds with rival. Maybe it's an act, maybe it wasn't. But for one reason or another, picking feuds with other entertainers. There were numerous people who worked for him. One was one of his managers, a fellow by the name of Yun. Others were performers. There were various people that he cheated, screwed over, or betrayed in one way or the other, who later on could be marshaled to say any number of bad things about them, some of which were probably true and some of which weren't. But he made a lot of personal enemies. And also among the other psychics the stage mentalists, hypnotists, astrologers in Berlin. As he became more and more famous, more and more of them resented him as well. So there were lots of people who were not fans, even though much of the public was. Most of the public was just kind of fascinated by his outlandish appearance. And he also begins marketing himself. He buys up a Berlin tabloid. He turns it into a sheet advertising himself. It's often, one description of it said that most of it was, this is a thing initially called the Berliner Wochenschau, kind of weekly, and he will get others, which then he changes the names of it a couple of times. That it was essentially a combination of his boasts and his predictions. So that's something else he's doing. He's always boasting about himself. So he's boasting about the predictions he's going to make before he has actually made them. Some people find that attractive. Some people find that incredibly annoying. So he's getting a lot of attention. He's getting money which comes in. And in September 1930, as Hanussen is now settled in Berlin, is becoming a big deal, this is when Adolf Hitler is becoming a big deal. So let me give a little background to that. Nazi Party was formed, at the very beginning, all the way back in 1919. Hitler becomes the dominant figure by 1921. The party has not really gone anywhere. It entered the electoral fray in 1924. There were 2 elections in that year. They got maybe 6% of the vote in the first one. That dropped by half, 3%. In 1928, there was another election, and the Nazis scored about 2.8% of the popular vote, and they were able to put 12 deputies in the Reichstag, the German parliament, out of more than 500. So they had no political significance. They were a fringe party up until 1928, even 1929. But that changes, the Depression comes along, that changes, and then you go from this, another election comes along at 30, and the Nazis surge from 12 seats to 107, now making them a significant party in the Reichstag, and making Hitler someone that other political leaders and parties now had to pay attention to. Especially alarmed the communists, who up to that point had been the main kind of revolutionary party, and now the Nazis come along. So as Hanussen becomes a big deal, Hitler becomes a big deal. And again, it's almost as if the links at the beginning, that somehow they're going to converge. And over the next couple of years, what does Hanussen do? He he builds a kind of empire for himself. I said, he was marketing his own sex cream. He markets his own, mystical divination tools. There's probably a Hanussen, magic helmet or turban that you can buy. Whatever he could sell to the gullible, he would do. And more publications touting his predictions. And he's acquiring a good deal of wealth. So he buys his own plane, which he can fly. He has a whole fleet of cars. His pride and joy is a Cadillac, which he drives around. But he's got other ones. And then he has his boat. He buys a yacht, the Ursel 4. But it's popularly known. This is how the German press christened his yacht, and he probably gave them the name. It's registered as the Ursel 4, but we like to call it the Seven Sins. So the yacht would be the scene. That thing I mentioned to begin with before, like hosting bizarre sex orgies. Yes, he did that, and those were covered in the press. And all the famous people that would show up, almost always there were movie cameras going while these things were going on.
Do we still have the film of that?
I don't know. But somebody did.
Jeez.
And now this is the thing to get. This is where things again get somewhat reminiscent of the one thing that Hanussen didn't have, as far as I can tell, is his own island. But had he lived
Yeah.
in more current decades, he might well have done that. His own island and a plane to ferry his friends there. So the yacht is kind of his Epstein's island. And he has theme parties that he will host there. And everyone dresses up in costumes. Drugs were publicly acknowledged to be openly available, including, I thought there was a specific reference to peyote,
Interesting.
mescaline,
Yeah.
which it was noted was not well known in Germany at the time.
Yeah.
And he kind of introduced it into Berlin. So he's inviting, now who goes to his parties? Industrialists, politicians. Some of them will later be Nazis, very important figures in not just Nazis, actors, actresses, captains of industry. And these people are brought into this kind of, the term Roman decadence was often used for this. And these events are being filmed and recorded, supposedly because later they could be played back and everybody could watch them and get off on them again. But, once you got something on film,
Yeah.
so unlimited opportunities to get important, influential people in incriminating circumstances.
Yeah.
All right. Sound familiar? So there's and that's the type of thing where you could then begin to wonder, well, how long has this type of thing been going on? I mean, what did Jeffrey Epstein originate, or what did he just perpetuate? Was he simply the continuation of this kind of organized shakedown racket, if that's what it is, that's been going on for decades? Or maybe it's just that the same minds think alike. So Hanussen became wealthy. How wealthy, it's really hard to say. There were the private, the stage performances didn't net him that much money. The private séances probably much more. There were probably gifts and contributions he got elsewhere. Now, this brings us up to early 1932. And at this point, Hitler thinks things are again going quite well for him. He and Hanussen have not really entered into Hanussen hasn't entered into Hitler's awareness other than as this celebrity. He couldn't have missed him even in Munich. And Hitler decides he's going to run for president. So, a couple of things to explain Weimar politics. There used to be the Kaiser. It's not, he's abdicated. And then in the Weimar, the Republic Constitution, the office of president is created as a stand-in for the monarch. So the president could do things like, most importantly, the president, in the absence of any kind of effective Reichstag, could invoke Article 48, which would allow rule by decree for a temporary dictatorship. Also gave the ability of the president to pick or approve the chancellor. So the president is the head of state, basically the stand-in for the emperor or king. And the chancellor is the head of government, who actually, same sort of thing you'd find. The parliamentary system of government. So Hitler will eventually become chancellor. That will be his route to power. But in 1932, he thinks that there's going to be a new presidential election. Now, the current president was an old World War I war hero by the name of Paul von Hindenburg, who's 80 years old,
Right,
if not more.
Yeah.
And Hindenburg had won the presidency back in 1925. Yeah. He's reluctant to run again in 1932 because, one, he's old.
Yeah.
But he eventually agrees to do it because the way he looks at it, if I don't run for president, I know that communist troublemaker Ernst Thälmann is going to run, and probably this Nazi pipsqueak Hitler is going to run, and somebody's got to keep the gutter snipes out of this office. So Hindenburg agrees to run, basically to keep either Hitler or Thälmann out of the chancellorship, because he thinks that the whole government couldn't collapse. So the elections for this take place, the first round of elections takes place in March, second round takes place in April. And the reason why there are two rounds is that under the electoral laws, a candidate has to get more than 50% to win. And in the first round of voting, Hindenburg gets 49.5%. Hitler gets about 30%, which isn't too bad. But so there has to be a second round. But Hitler's not going to be president. Okay, it was an overestimation. There's no way that, so in between. So in March, the first round has come. Hitler knows he's not going to make it. The second round is virtually a foregone conclusion. Something else is that this presidential campaign has cost the Nazi Party lots and lots of money. So for an example, they had to pay organizers and agitators to set up and supervise 125,000 rallies across the country. They're also enrolling more and more unemployed into the SA, into the brown shirts. Now, here's an interesting little detail. You did not need to be a member of the Nazi Party to belong to the SA. You know, you could. It was usually a route to joining the party, but you don't have to. So the SA, the brown shirts, are full of a lot of guys who are basically there because they're unemployed. And if you join the SA, you get this brown set of clean clothes, and you get a certain amount of pocket money, and you get food and housing.
Yeah.
It's essentially the Nazi Party's welfare program. And then what do you get out of that? An army of thugs.
Yeah.
Okay, to unleash. But that's an interesting way to think about it, is that the so-called brown shirts are not totally composed or mostly composed by die-hard committed National Socialists. It's often composed by desperate guys who are doing this as a way to get a crust of bread and a little bit of money and maybe the fun of beating somebody up. But the actual politics of it, they're not all that interested in.
Is that why I think I've talked about it before, but Eric Hoffer, True Believer, talks about, you know, you can be a brown shirt one day and you can be a communist the next.
Yeah.
And it just switched back and forth, and it wasn't really so much about ideology as it was about, I'm not you.
Well, and the communists have this thing, you know, they have the Rote Frontkämpferbund, Frontkämpferbund, the front fighters, the Red Front Fighters League. And that was their version of the brown shirts. And these are the guys who would brawl with each other. And sometimes people would go back and forth. They'd go over and join the SA and get some money, and then go over and join the communists. So what happens, a number of things sort of come together at this point. So Hitler enters into this presidential campaign. The first round in March shows that he's not going to win. In January, just a few weeks before, Hanussen had bought the Berliner Wochenschau, which he now turns into this kind of tabloid mouthpiece. And initially, if you look at issues of that in January and February, he pretty much makes fun of politicians, including Hitler. There's nothing which is
off limits,
you know, pro-Nazi or anti-Nazi in it. But then, in March, right after that first round failure of Hitler in the presidential vote, the tenor of the paper changes. And Hanussen predicts great things for the Fuhrer. Now, this happens in actually the midst of a political setback. And Hanussen comes along and goes, you know, I predict that within a year, Adolf Hitler will be Chancellor of Germany. And I furthermore predict that the man who will usher him into that position will be none other than Paul von Hindenburg, his opponent in the current presidential election. Both of those predictions become absolutely true. So again, you got the choice. Either Hanussen could actually, you know, maybe he just ran the odds. Now, this also is sort of in the way that he would later explain his support of the Nazis, because he does have a friend or two who corner him on this. I go, what's going on, Harry? Okay, what's with the whole Nazi thing? And it seems, actually, that's where the explanation came up, is that I do what I always do. I looked at the angles and I ran the odds. And the idea was that, well, you know, Hitler's up and coming, and it's pretty much either going to be him or the communists. And I don't think the communists have the oomph to carry this off. I think there would be too many forces against them. But Hitler is kind of acceptable to the status quo. The industrialists and the generals will go with him. They're never going to go with the communists. So he's the most likely to come along. So that was his explanation to one, is that it wasn't a psychic revelation. I just ran the odds and figured I might as well back what appears to be the stronger horse. It's a kind of gamble. But what I find really interesting about this is that Hanussen's open support, his open, it's not even, he gets argued, this is just what I predicted. What I saw, what the stars told me, is that Hitler within a year will be chancellor and Hindenburg will make him so. And Hanussen would argue, this doesn't make me a cheerleader for the Nazis, that just makes me a psychic. But that obviously came as tremendous, to Hitler, this was kind of water in the desert, because now the party's kind of broke, and now this guy, I've got support there. So and it happens at that juncture, and I cannot escape the hunch that that's not an accident. That in addition to everything else, that Hanussen knew that was the moment to pounce in a way. What you do is that when Hitler is down, when there's been a setback, that's when you come in to the rescue.
Yeah.
Now, shortly thereafter, in April of that year, there is the fellow who is the head of the SA in Berlin, a fellow by the name of Count von Helldorf. And Count von Helldorf is pretty much a committed Nazi. He'll later turn against Hitler, and he will actually be shot for his involvement in the 1944 attempt to blow him up. So he will later so maybe even his loyalty wasn't that strong. But Helldorf is an interesting guy. And as the story goes, as he tells it, he went to a couple of Hanussen's performances, and being, as he described it, a student of the black arts, because what else would he be? He was fascinated by Hanussen, and he had to meet him. I've just got to meet this guy. And so he gets an actress that he knows, a woman by the name of Maria Paudler, to introduce him to Hanussen. And that apparently goes reasonably well. And then Hanussen invites him to a special yacht party that's going to be held the following week. And it's an Asian theme night party. It's called A Night in the Orient. And so Hanussen's going to be dressed up like a llama, and everybody else has to. And there's a giant Hindu lingam that is a giant penis on the forefront of the ship, like a Viking prow, although it's a dick. And then there are other people, and then you have all sorts of servants and extras he's hired from the theater, including a lot of colorful ethnic, including some Indian boys or Indian students who are there to add Hindu color to the proceedings. And in the course of the evening, as the mescaline and what other drugs and liquor flow, Helldorf gets completely wasted and for some reason takes great offense to one of the Indian servants who's there as an extra and just begins whipping him to within an inch of his life, just goes after this kid and just beats him bloody with cameras in front of witnesses. And then as he's finished, drunkenly or druggedly proclaims, "There, I admit it, and you can all see it. I am a sadist." So this is the kind of guy that Hanussen is now making friends with. The head of the Berlin Brown Shirts, who is an avowed occultist black arts fanboy, and who is a sadist. And also, one more thing. He's also a compulsive gambler. And he's run up 300,000 marks in gambling debts, which is a lot. Now, what happens after this party? What would happen if someone did that at your Asian theme night party? You probably wouldn't invite them back, right? So is Hanussen going to go, "Oh, this guy's, he's never coming back"? No. 2 days after the party, Hanussen pays off half of Helldorf's gambling debt. Wow. Just pays it off and then buys up the rest of it for himself.
What, to own the debt, basically?
Yeah, so he owns the debt.
Okay.
So he pays half of it off
So now
outright.
you're a hawk to me.
But now you owe. See, you only owe me. You used to owe these other people 300,000 marks.
Yeah.
Now you just owe me 150,000 marks.
Extra leverage.
Hey, Heldorf, like that kind of looks that way. Maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the Count gets to go to lots more parties. In fact, he and Hanussen just become as thick as thieves. And Heldorf becomes this, he's described by some people as a major domo for Hanussen's parties. He's the guy, if you go to the parties, that you have to get the introduction to get an introduction to Hanussen. So they are buds.
Wow.
And now, finding out that Hanussen has all this extra money and can pay off gambling debts, well, soon after, Heldorf's adjutant, a fellow by the name of Wilhelm Ost, his second in command, and also a personal enemy, apparently, Ost has he has a certain problem. It appears that he has borrowed 40,000 marks from the SA coffers. And he needs to pay it back. And Hanussen settles the debt for him. And then other stormtroopers and others in the Nazi party, and now there are more and more people who begin to show up asking for money or for loans, and it's not quite, and one of those people is Hermann Goering.
Oh, really?
By later testimony, I've never heard this out of Hermann Goering's mouth, that Goering, got huge sums of money from Hanussen.
Strange as it seems. This is great.
So this is kind of broadening now. So Goering is not part of the brown shirts. He's outside of that. Very close to Hitler. But the question again that occurs to me is, where is Hanussen getting all this money? Does he have all this money on his own? It's possible. Or is Hanussen a gateway for other people's money? So let's say you were, I don't know, a consortium of American and British bankers. Something like that maybe. Or the French general staff, and you'd kind of like to funnel some money to the Nazis, but you don't want anybody to know that you funneled any
Cromwell.
money. Sullivan and Cromwell. So what you do is that the money goes into a bank account that Hanussen has access to, and then Hanussen loans your money to members in the Nazi party, and nobody can trace it because it's all Hanussen's, this crazy stage psychic.
Yeah.
I think that's what was going on. Because Hanussen starts throwing way too much money around. Where he's coming to, paying off debts, gambling debts for SA men is one thing. Large sums of money to Hermann Goering becomes something else.
So how would he have these connections, you think, between like British intelligence or something? Would somebody approach him, you think? Or was it...
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Who's going to be interested in the information he has? Okay, it's the same question you could ask about Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, okay.
Who would possibly be interested on dirt on powerful American political figures or economic figures? Powerful people. Who might be interested in that? And yes, intelligence agencies will be a part of it. But for now, the money. So the Nazi connections, inevitably, this is going to lead up to an introduction to Hitler.
Yeah.
Why? Hitler's the head of the party. He's going to hear about this. He may not hear about it from Heldorf, but he's going to hear about it from Goering. And if Goering tells him, look, there's this rich stage magician in Berlin who can, he's first of all the guy who said you were going to be chancellor, and he's also has access to all of this money. So the story generally goes is that it's Heldorf who introduces Hanussen to Hitler. I'm not sure I believe that because I'm not sure that Heldorf himself was close enough to Hitler for that to happen. But Goering was. Others have proposed it was a writer that they knew in common, a fellow by the name of Hans Heinz Evers, who he's sometimes called the German H.P. Lovecraft. A writer, sometimes a horror writer, who had become a really enthusiastic Nazi for about 15 minutes at this point. And who also, guess who else Hans Heinz Evers knew? Aleister Crowley.
I was the whole time I was.
You knew. Okay, Aleister Crowley makes his first creeping appearance. Yeah. His little cat feet.
Well, that from the beginning, I was like, this feels. Crowley's got to show up.
Crowley's going to show up somewhere. Yeah. Well, keep in mind, Crowley is living in Berlin while all of this is going on.
Oh, I have a vague...
Kroling
we
is
talked
living
about
in
that once.
Berlin from also mid part of 1930 through the mid part of 1932. So he has a front row seat.
Well, with the way
all of this.
the way you're describing Hanussen and then the connections to Epstein, it made me think about Crowley in a different way, and I'm sure he facilitated in some respects some of that, transfer of information, or I don't know about money. He sounds like he was always poor, but I was telling somebody about this whole show the other day who doesn't know. I was like, I do a podcast, and trying to explain to them, what you and I have discussed, that folks like stage magicians or occultists or cults or whatever are really good things for intelligence communities, assets, or, just the agencies themselves to funnel nefarious things through, like money that they don't want traced, or guns, or, somebody commented on our last episode, it's like the octopus murders. Like, that's a perfect, contemporary example.
See how that same mollusk keeps showing up? Well, I've said this before, all you have to do is mention, you know why cults are so popular? Because if you say the word cult, people's eyes light up. Yeah. Okay. You immediately have their attention. Okay. Right. And that's just one step from getting them to join the cult, isn't it? Okay. People who are afraid of cults are also in some way attracted to cults. Think about that. So don't join a cult unless you're already in one, which you wouldn't know. So one way or the other, Hanussen and Hitler meet around June 1932. And my suspicion, what I think is the way I would explain it, is that Hitler just approached him. I mean, why not? Everybody else in the party is. All these other people are there. We have something in common. You said I was going to be chancellor. I'm kind of superstitious. You're a psychic, and you have money. So maybe we should talk. They do. And those meetings will continue all the way up through the early part of 1933. So Hanussen's and Hitler's relationship is not a long one. It is a matter of months, but it occurs at a very critical period. Because in 1932, the whole political stakes of Weimar Germany are very high. In July, so they meet in June of 1932, and in July there's going to be another round of voting, because at this point, every time a government falls, you have to have another election. And Hanussen assures Hitler that you're going to do great. Okay, the Nazis, and they do. They go from 107 seats to, I think, something like, 230. And that makes them the single biggest party in the Reichstag. Keep in mind, there are many parties. But see how this has gone? You're a fringe party a couple of years before. Most people outside of Munich have never heard of you. You're just some kind of Austrian weirdo with a thing about Jews. Now you're one of the political contenders in Germany, whether Paul von Hindenburg and people in the establishment like it or not. So the general story goes that, well, what did Hitler get out of his relationship with Hanussen? Well, Hanussen knows about hypnotism, and he knows about stage technique. So the story you always get is that Hanussen gave Hitler basically elocution lessons and taught him how to wave his hands around convincingly and to speak more effectively. That's bullshit for this reason. Hitler had been a noted dynamic public speaker for a decade. He'd been giving speeches. Now, true, Hanussen might have given him some pointers in mind control, maybe. But in terms of just hand gestures and speaking, that Hitler knew that.
Yeah.
He didn't have to learn that from Hanussen. What did Hitler most want from Hanussen?
Money.
In the future.
Oh.
Okay, this is the hook. Hanussen's hook is, see, he's predicting things. And the things that he's predicted are either tantalizing or they're going to come, or they come true.
Was he upfront about his predicting abilities as far as they weren't necessarily magical? I might have missed that.
To Hitler? No.
No.
Only to certain associates.
Okay.
Would do that. So, I mean, to people who knew, to people in the profession, who are never going to, we're probably not going to take genuine psychic abilities seriously. Now, but the same people he'd argue that sometimes these things just come over me. Sometimes I do see these things. Oddly enough, what he never seems to see is his pending death. Okay. You'd figure if you were a psychic, you'd know not to go to the Scala Theater on the day that he goes
Well, it
there.
goes back to what
I misses that.
were we talking about it when we did the Patreon book review for this time? But the branches of time. We're on a different timeline. Maybe he just couldn't see.
Maybe he couldn't see.
One of his death. Yeah.
So he and Adolf developed this kind of mutual admiration society. In Hanussen's publications by this time have become blatantly, stridently pro-Nazi. And everybody, the communists hate him for that. And in fact, there's one communist journalist who's also Jewish and also Czech, by the name of Bruno Frey. And Bruno Frey, he comes to a kind of interesting idea. He thinks that Hanussen is the kind of stage counterpart to Hitler. He also sees that there's some sort of connection.
Yeah.
And that he thinks that if I can prove that Hanussen is a fraud, I can thereby destroy. In fact, at one point he called Frey, a communist, calls Hanussen Hitler's spiritual father. And if I can discredit his spiritual father, if I can discredit his guru, then that will undermine the whole, what Frey is basically saying, sort of occult underpinnings of the Nazi Party. Frey's view is that it's not really a political ideology. It's some sort of weird cult. Mm-hmm. And this weird cult has now gotten its shaman or its guru, and that's Hanussen. And if I can discredit... So how is he going to discredit him? One, show he's a fraud. Mm-hmm. Two, prove he's a Jew.
Yeah.
Because, he's hanging out with Nazis. Wouldn't that be sort of embarrassing? Wouldn't that just be so humiliating to Hitler that, of course, that would cause millions of people to not vote for the Nazi Party? He's wrong about that. They probably wouldn't care. But Frey goes out, and Frey finds all these disgruntled employees, and he goes after the public records. They're not that hard to find. The birth records, the marriage records, all these other people that knew Harry Steinschneider back when.
Yeah.
Okay, and all of these people know that he's Jewish. And all of them basically attest that he's a fraud. And Frey, helped by these people, then goes into this kind of press campaign, which his frustration, even though he thinks, and he can actually prove these allegations. What he really wants to do, he's trying to goad Hitler into suing him for libel. Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to accuse you of being a Jewish charlatan. You sue me for calling you that, because that's exactly what I want to do. I want to go in and in court prove that you are. I want all of this sort of read into court testimony. Hanussen is not going to do that. He'll eventually be goaded into it at the very end, but he tries to avoid that as much as possible. So he's clearly thrown in his lot with the Nazis. And then in the fall of 1932, there's another government falls, and there's another election. And in this case, Hanussen's been kind of upbeat about it. And Hitler's expecting to make even bigger, and the Nazi vote declines. It goes from like 230 seats to 196. Not a huge setback, but no more leverage than you had before. Your power is decreasing. Hitler, as usual, freaks out. Okay, there's been somebody, and I'm sure he went to Hanussen and go, "What went wrong?" You said, "Well, you actually did pretty well. You're still, the biggest party in the Reichstag, even with 196 seats. And just hang on. I'm going to reiterate my whole sort of claim that you're going to be chancellor. You will. Trust me." And Hitler does. Now, around this time, Bruno Frey's outing campaign begins to bear fruit. And he will publish his own findings, and he develops this whole dossier. And he also that fall, sends a copy of all the dirt he has on Hanussen, or Steinschneider, to Joseph Goebbels, another prominent Nazi, you know him, who edits a Nazi newspaper called Der Angriff, the attack. Okay, and Goebbels is the editor, and Goebbels gets this stuff. And now Goebbels, by the way, is no fan of Hanussen. Very simple reason for that. If you have a prophet, who needs a propagandist?
Yeah.
A propagandist is trying to make things happen that the prophet tells you is already going to happen. So Goebbels is jealous of Hanussen, so he's really likes this stuff. And so it's something like December the 12th issue of Der Angriff. There's a whole headline, and that the Jew Steinschneider, okay, son of rabbis, okay, proven to be, not only is a Jew, but he's a Czech Jew. And lots of people in the Nazi Party read this. Count von Helldorf reportedly marches into Hanussen's office and probably says something like, "What the hell? What is this? Explain this." What does Hanussen do? Reaches into his desk and pulls out that adoption certificate and tells him the whole sad tale of how his Danish noble parents were killed in a Moravian mountain climbing accident, and he was adopted by the kindly Jewish couple. And Helldorf goes, "Oh, okay." So relieved. And then someone leans on Goebbels because 2 days later, the Angriff prints a retraction.
Interesting.
Everything, we said about Hanussen being a Jew, apparently we were wrong. Even though Goebbels knows he's not wrong.
Yeah.
All the stuff, he's got plenty of evidence. So who would lean on him?
Hitler.
Yeah. Okay. Another way to explain. Well, Helldorf doesn't have that kind of authority. Hitler leaned on Goebbels.
Yeah.
To leave his soothsayer alone. But what all of this really means, keep in mind, there are two things here. One, Hanussen's Jewishness had always been an open secret. Everybody sort of knew it and talked about it. There certainly were people in the Nazi Party, Helldorf, Hermann Goering, others, who would have gotten wind of this, and they never asked him about it. He's never been challenged on this before.
Weren't there fairly prominent people, I don't know, the SS? Probably not. But I thought people with like mixed heritage, parentage, and they were like, well, I'm not really Jewish. And they were part of the party.
They did the same thing. The Nazis, including, would make exceptions for anybody that they wanted to make. They're just like Carl Lueger. All right. Yeah. I'll decide who's a Jew and who isn't. And that's what they did to Hanussen. They Luegered him.
Yeah.
They knew what he was. I think they'd always know. And now this is on public display. There's ample records proving this. And they just decide to pretend it's not there. Now, I bring this up to show that Hanussen will be killed, and he will certainly be killed by people connected to the Nazi Party, but I would argue that he is not killed because they suddenly find out that he's a Jew. No, they'd known that. Okay. It's not like, oh, we didn't know that. No, you knew that. You just didn't care because everything he's doing is helping you.
Right.
You just ignore it. You just pretend that it's not there. So what eventually happens? Well, January 30th, 1933 rolls along, and Paul von Hindenburg, as part of a backroom deal and in desperation, names Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Hanussen's predictions come true. At that point, he's what more does he have to do? He has made the prediction. Of course, the Nazis still have to keep the power because what Hindenburg giveth, Hindenburg can taketh away. So it's not a dictatorship yet, but Hanussen in February, so that's at the end of January, and in the weeks that follow, what happens? He joins the Nazi Party. The records of his joining, by the way, subsequently disappear from party records. Who? He was never here. Hanussen who? He's also joins the SA. He has a brown shirt uniform. He has a Nazi swastika medallion that is put on the grille of his Cadillac that he drives all over town. He has 25 SA men that are his own security for his parties and his person. His secretary, his personal secretary, a Bosnian by the name of Ismet Zeno, at least we think he's a Bosnian, nobody's entirely sure. He's basically Hanussen's real bodyguard. He also joins the Nazi party and the SA. So it's just one big Nazi party. I mean, you've predicted Hitler's going to become chancellor, and he becomes chancellor, and you're in the party, and they know you're a Jew, and they don't care. What could possibly go wrong? Now, it's around this time that Hanussen, in talking to another friend, another stage performer, and in fact, a hypnotist, I think, by the name of Fred...
Chrisman. No.
Not Fred Chrisman, no. Something like Fred Million. Oh, Fred Marion. That's his stage name. And Fred Marion, they're probably having a couple of drinks, and this guy goes, you're like, what's with it? Do you really believe this stuff? Are you actually a Nazi? Because you're Jewish. And he goes, I just kind of ran the odds, but I think maybe I may have gone too far, and I'm not sure how I'm going to get out of this. Because how do I disengage from this exactly? And he did have kind of a plan. And part of his plan was that I'm going to get a lot of money together. And when I think I have enough, I'm going to go to America. And in America, I'm going to write a tell-all book about everything I know about the Nazis and everybody else in Berlin. All the stuff from the yacht and everything else. That's what I'm going to do. It's going to be bad stuff about the Nazis. And I'll make $1 million. So it's a big double cross.
Yeah.
And, I'm just going to take what I know, and I'm going to, but I have to be able to. But he wondered even then whether he would be able to manage that. Are they going to let me go at this point? So Marion sensed basically that both Hanussen was being his usual boastful self, but he also thought that he actually seemed sort of fatalistic about something. Well, then we come to the grand opening of Hanussen's Palace of the Occult. So he had taken over an entire floor in a building in Berlin, and he had turned this at great expense into a kind of nightclub, which he called the Palace of the Occult, and had different rooms with different themes in it, and there were lots of scantily clad women. There were 4 giant statues of Buddha. There was all the kind of weird astrological shit that you would expect to be around this place. And so the grand opening for this is on February 26th, 1933. So the festivities begin. Count Helldorf is there, ushering people in. And around midnight, Helldorf takes 20 select special guests into the Room of Silence, in which there's this lighted table, this kind of round table that people sit on. This has actually been reproduced in certain movies about Hanussen, and this is a real thing. And you got astrological symbols, Hanussen seated on a lighted stool, and Helldorf will forward their questions to him. But then, sometime just after midnight, or late, Hanussen gets the same actress, Maria Paudler, she fancied she had some mediumistic powers, and he wants to put her in a trance and ask her questions. She wrote a memoir in which she describes the situation this way. Well, let me describe it the way that it usually comes to. He puts Maria Paudler into a trance, and in that trance, she sees a great building on fire. There's a huge fire. The way she describes it is that she didn't want to do the trance. She was drunk at the time, And he just sort of badgered her into doing it, and he put her into a trance, and she felt really relaxed, but she was never in a total trance. And then he started talking about red flames. Do you see red flames? And she really didn't see red flames, but she wasn't sure. And then he goes, do you see a great building on fire? Do you see a great building on fire? And in her version, she never said, I do. He said it. He kept asking her if she did. But that she never actually saw a great building on fire. She was never in a total trance, and then she pretended to faint to make the whole thing end. Okay, so this is the description of supposed prediction of what's going to happen 20 hours later. The Reichstag, the German parliament, will catch on fire and go up in a huge blaze. That blaze, the Reichstag fire, will then be used by Hitler to get President von Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 and hand Hitler temporary dictatorial powers. And one of the reasons they're so worried about that, guess what's, this is this is February 27th. What's coming up on March 5th? Another election. And of course, everything will depend. Hitler's job as chancellor depends upon him keeping the Nazi numbers in the Reichstag. Should those drop, Hindenburg will replace him as chancellor. And everything they've done up to this point could collapse. So the assumption to this day, and I think you're correct, is that in some way the Nazis instigated the burning of the Reichstag to create a crisis that they could then use in particular to suppress the communists in Berlin and other cities. And that's one of the things they do. And that Hanussen got himself into trouble by predicting this ahead of time. Now, again, keep in mind, whatever happened that night or morning at the Palace of the Occult, nobody ever uttered the word Reichstag. Maria Paudler says she never said she even saw a burning building. But Hanussen would claim that this was said. So he goes out of his way. So one of the arguments is that what happened is that, Hanussen just got carried away and he let the cat out of the bag about something he shouldn't have. No, he deliberately did this. In fact, it's even weirder than that. When did Erik Jan Hanussen first predict the imminent destruction of the Reichstag? Back in September 1932. In one of his astrological publications, he had a horoscope cast for the Reichstag. I didn't know you could do that for buildings, but apparently you can. And this predicted that the Reichstag would be destroyed in divine retribution for something. So he'd predicted that back in September. And now, for some reason, he was trying to get her, I think that's what he was trying to get her to do. And then he said that she had done it when she actually hadn't. 2 days after the supposed seance where she said this, he republishes the horoscope just in case anybody didn't notice it the first time. See, I predicted this back in September. No, so this wasn't a mistake that Hanussen made. He didn't mistakenly let the cat out of the bag about the Reichstag. He went out of his way to create the whole framework for it and to try to make another one of his predictions come true. It was deliberate. Now, the Reichstag fire, the guy who's arrested for it at the scene, half naked with torches and gasoline in his hand, is this Dutch former communist, 24-year-old guy by the name of Marinus van der Lubbe, who seems to be generally out of it. He's always out of it. The best is van der Lubbe, I think among other things, he'd been an amateur boxer and had been hit in the head too often. So he's loopy. Van der Lubbe can't give. And he had been involved for years with the Dutch Communist Party and had been quite militant in the party. And he liked, getting into fights, and he was a perfect candidate for the SA, which maybe he was, because when did van der Lubbe come to Berlin? Well, the seance was on the 26th of February, and the Reichstag fire was the evening of the 27th of February. He didn't show up in Berlin until the 19th of February. He shows up, takes a train out of the Netherlands, goes to Berlin, and within a week, he's decided to burn the German parliament. Or was that what he was brought there for to begin with? So, the term patsy, van der Lubbe has all the hallmarks of being a... Who's patsy? Not entirely clear. Now, you then get these later stories, I would say stories, not things that people say happen, is that, well, van der Lubbe, a lot of people thought, behaved like he was hypnotized. He just seemed like there was something, he would just repeat these things he was told. It's almost like maybe you should pass the time by playing a game of solitaire. So, I'll see how many people get that reference. So, and Hanussen is fingered as the guy who did that. But this story also says who brought van der Lubbe to Hanussen. So remember, van der Lubbe isn't even in Berlin until the 19th of February. So he would have had to have been brought to Hanussen fairly quickly. Who brought another Nazi, again, close to the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, an enemy of Hitler, by the way, by the name of Georg Bell. His family's Scottish, which is where the Bell name. But Georg Bell he'd been the head of Röhm's personal intelligence service. He was also a convicted forger and spy. He'd been found guilty of both of those. But nevertheless, Röhm trusted him. Now, for those, Ernst Röhm, a former soldier, who is really the guy who sort of creates the brown shirts, and then got pissed off at Hitler in the mid-20s, went to South America to run the Bolivian army, who Hitler then brings back, begs to come back in 1931. But this is the same Ernst Röhm that Hitler will have assassinated in 1934, in the Night of the Long Knives. Röhm and Hitler are enemies. Röhm is also, again, part of this left wing of the Nazi Party that thinks that Hitler is a sellout to the generals and the capitalists. And he's already, in February 1933, talking about we need a second revolution because Hitler can't carry things through. So, remember the whole idea about Hanussen being a root of money? What if some of that money was just going to Röhm and the SA? It wasn't going to the party as a whole. I mean, there is, I'm reasonably convinced, a whole network of conspiracy, and that's what it is in this, that you don't quite see. Now, okay, so what really complicates this whole thing? Georg Bell had been a Nazi linked to Röhm and the command of the SA, who had then worked for Röhm. Up to this point, I have never seen any contact between he and Hanussen, although he probably knew who he was. Oh, by the way, Röhm also supposedly gets a handout from Hanussen. In fact, the story was that Röhm showed up at Hanussen's barber every week to get his envelope. You're showing up every week, just like the mafia. You're showing up to get an envelope, to get your payoff, regular payoff to the head of the brown shirts, and apparently everybody else. So Hanussen's moved a lot of money around. Well, the problem with this whole scenario, that Georg Bell, on behalf of the Nazis, found this Dutch patsy for Hanussen to do an MK Ultra number on with hypnotism, is the fact that in February 1933, Georg Bell was no longer with the Nazis. He'd broken with them months earlier, and in fact had gone over to the other side and was helping an anti-Nazi liberal journalist campaign against them. So why would Bell, who's supposedly on the outs with the Nazi Party, help Hanussen graft a patsy to set the Reichstag fire for the Nazis? Bell's not working for the Nazis. Now, maybe the Nazis, maybe there's, this whole story about Bell is just somebody's fantasy, but it really sort of brings in some strange things. And maybe the strangest one is this. Hanussen will be swept off the streets of Berlin outside the Scala Theater on around the 25th of March, so about a month later, and will never be seen again. And his body, his decomposing, bullet-ridden body, will be found in woods south of Berlin on the 7th of April. Georg Bell, after the Reichstag fire, will flee Germany and go to Austria, which is still a separate country, where on the 3rd of April, 4 days before Hanussen's body is found, he will be assassinated by gunmen in a cafe. So Bell and Hanussen, who are linked together in this story of programming van der Lubbe to set fire to the Reichstag, are killed by unknown people presumed to be Nazis at almost the same time. Is that a coincidence? Or does it could be, or not a coincidence, it's an accident. Is it just an accident that happens? Or is that because they're both involved in the same thing? And that brings up the intriguing possibility that what was going on with the whole Reichstag fire was a kind of inner Nazi dispute. That it may actually in some way, I'm not sure how, have been instigated to try to implicate or undermine Hitler. So remember, when that happens, Hitler's position as chancellor is still quite insecure. There's an election coming up that could go either way. Hindenburg could just walk in at any moment and dismiss him as chancellor. Rem is talking about a second revolution. Bell has a past connection to Rem, but now appears to be completely broken from the Nazis. Was he just pretending to be? Is he connected with Rem? But that, I think, is a secret as to why Hanussen is killed. He's not killed because they suddenly discovered he was a Jew. They knew that already. He's killed because he was implicated in some kind of inner Nazi feud, which is taking place between Hitler's faction and possibly Rem's. It's just an early version of the Night of the Long Knives, which is going to come in the following year. And then the other thing about it is the money angle to it. So some people have argued, and it sounds good at face value, is that, Helldorf and the rest of there were a lot of Nazis like Helldorf who were indebted to Hanussen. And maybe now they just figured that, we're in power, which they weren't totally yet, so we don't need a prophet anymore, right? I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Hanussen had predicted that Hitler was going to be chancellor. Now he's chancellor. So do you want him to keep, it's at some point, what if your soothsayer gives you bad news? Well, that's also something that Hanussen claimed that he had seen, that the Nazis are going to come to a bad end. That's why he needs to get out of here. And there's even a story, always the stories, that he did a special séance for Hermann Goering, and Goering asked, how's this going to turn out? And Hanussen told him the whole thing. Okay, it's all going to go well for a while, and then there's going to be a war, and that'll look good. Then it's going to go really, really bad, and you're all going to end up hanging, taking poison, and Hitler's going to blow his brains out in a bunker. That's how it's going to end. And at any rate, the story was that Goering was so freaked out by what Hanussen told him that he never went to another one of these again. So, what if he starts saying stuff like that? So you might want to get rid of him for that reason. We don't need him. But maybe they think they figured out some internal plot that he was involved in, or they suspected him of being part of, which would mean what historically? It means that there's more to the whole history of the Nazi rise to power in terms of where money came from, in terms of how it was transferred into the party. It also means that even in terms of the inner working of the Nazi Party, once it began to establish power, there are lots of mysteries. And at the center of that mystery, I'd argue, no one stands taller than Erik Jan Hanussen, because he wasn't Erik Jan Hanussen at all. And that's how he becomes the man that one day no one could stop talking about, to the man the next day that nobody knew. What did the German police actually say about his murder? They thought that he probably had been rubbed out at some sort of personal dispute. It was known that he had lots of enemies, and one of those enemies must have killed him, which is almost certainly true. They just never defined what that dispute was. And we'll end it there. Okay, an addendum. As Stephen just reminded me, we didn't mention the man with the green gloves, because that's in the Green Dragon, and supposedly there's a character. Well, there's a character in that story. The man with the green gloves, that this British and French agent posing as bankers are supposed to be introduced to. They're supposed to be introduced to him, and then he's going to introduce them to the man with the two Z's that is pretty clearly within the context of the book, Hitler. And everything, the man with the green gloves is described in the book, The Seven Heads of the Green Dragon, as being a well-known stage hypnotist who had accurately predicted the number of Nazi elected to the Reichstag. Well, that's Hanussen. No one else did that. That's clearly who it was. But then when you actually get to the meeting, it's unclear what this individual was. I think I said before that he's usually described as an Asian, but hold on a minute, because he's not, as far as I can tell, not actually described as an Asian. In fact, I'm not sure what they're describing. But what about Hanussen and the green gloves? Now, I think on our thumbnail for the Green Dragon, Stephen created Hanussen wearing green gloves, except then no picture I can find of Erik Hanussen. Look yourself. There are many images out there. Is he ever wearing any kind of gloves? Why? Because his hands were part of his act. And it was important for him to use the hands, so he never wore green gloves. In fact, I can't find anywhere contemporary that he's ever referred to by that term. Supposedly, someone in the German press called him that. I don't know. Maybe there's some sort of stray press article somewhere, but Hanussen in no known image ever appears wearing gloves. He was not talked about or advertised himself as the man with the green gloves. So that seems to be something else. So in Seven Heads of the Green Dragon, what is it that Teddy Legrand and James Nobody actually encounter, supposedly, when they go to this villa to meet the man with the green gloves, who isn't Hanussen? Well, they are ushered into his presence by a butler who is specifically described as being Asian. Asian butler. Now, when the master of the house appears, he's described as standing absolutely motionless. There is no movement. His lips do not move when he speaks in a perfect Oxford English voice. And his eyes are described as painted lacquer, and he's also adorned with priestly ornaments. So my question would be, what the hell is that? Okay, that isn't like a person, it's like an automaton of some kind. Now, only when in his last sentence to them, which is something like, "Okay, gentlemen, tomorrow night you will come at 6 p.m. and meet the man with the two Z's," his lips move and they're surprised. But you got this thing that stands like a statue, lips don't move when he speaks, speaks in a strange English voice, I don't even know what lacquered eyes would be. Are those eyes? Are they painted eyes? This looks like a statue or an automaton or someone in some kind of elaborate disguise, which could be Hanussen. Remember, he dressed up as a llama on the boat. So maybe that was him trying to disguise what he looked like, or maybe this is just a story, which is the most likely part of it, but it's a strange description. There's even this little difference. In German, the man with the two Z's, the one that's presumed to be Hitler, and yes, I mean, he's on the cover of the book, so it's got to be him, is the term used for him is Mann, M-A-N-N, which in German means man. Pretty simple. But the man with the green gloves, the term is not Mann, it's Mensch, which is not quite the same thing. Mensch generally means person or human. So Mensch, so it's not even identifying this figure clearly as a man in the sense as the man of the two Z's. It's the Mensch. It's kind of the person, the thing, not quite thing, but humanoid creature in this. So, just one mystery on top of another one. There we go.